Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be tying the Hawaiian Shrimp Fly. This is a fly that a guide introduced me to while fishing for bonefish in Hawaii. Now, while it worked extremely well for that application, I've also found it works equally as well here in Virginian waters for a number of different species of fish. This includes making a fantastic shrimp imitation in saltwater for fish like redfish and speckled trout and other predatory species. But it works very well in freshwater as well for smallmouth bass and other fish that like to go after small crustaceans and invertebrates. Now this is meant to be tied as a guide fly, so tied very sparse, but I've spruced it up a bit and added one or two more things. So your basic materials, obviously, we're going to need a hook. I like to use a Gamakatsu SC15 in size 1/0, but you can use another hook as well. You could use something like a B10S. You may need to size down to a size 4 or size 6, depending on the hook that you use. For our thread, I like to use an orange UTC 140. I like to use thread that's a little bit thinner. We use two different types of flash in the variation that I tie. The first, in the tail, we're going to tie with a crystal or crinkle flash, depending on who you talk to. And of course, we're going to stick with the theme of orange. For the head of the fly, we're going to put on a very thin flash. This is particular flash I like to use is a Fluoro fiber, and it's in a shrimp color. Really, you could use a midge flash, or if you don't have anything very small and thin, just regular flash if you want to, or a mitt. For the body, we like to use some orange bucktail. And then we like to also put in some orange silly rubber legs. Again, I have some here that are multicolored, but you can really use any that you would like. For the main body, what we're going to do to add bulk without adding a ton of material is use this orange Estaz chenille. And then finally, we're going to use some dumbbell eyes. In this case, I like to use large, so it helps invert the fly that much better. Now we're going to see how to tie this fly sped up very quickly without instruction, but afterwards we'll see a more in-depth tutorial. Now it's time to see the steps in more detail. First is we're going to go ahead and place the hook on the vise. Now this should be a great time actually if you're going to debarb the hook, and it should be tight enough that it sings when you flick it. I like to now place my thread wraps. I always start from the eye of the hook and I'll work all the way back, then flat section of the hook shank. On this particular hook, that's actually in between the point and the barb of the hook, but that's going to be different depending on the individual hook that you're tying on. After I get to the end of the flat section, I'm going to come up just a bit forward, and that's where we're going to put in our thread bump. And this is actually going to be where we do our dumbbell eyes. You notice this is a little different than, say, a more traditional position like here on this half and half, where the eyes are tied much closer to the hook eye. That's going to allow this fly to ride, well, a little bit differently and have a slightly different action. So here's the fly when it's finished. Again, the eyes are much farther back, and it is going to kind of scoot along the bottom a little bit better and a little bit more nose up. This should cause less hang-ups, and it actually could sit upright, kind of like this, in a little bit of a different position. Okay, so like I said, we're going to put in our thread bump. This helps lock the dumbbell eyes in place, and this is just a series of wraps in the same spot. The next thing we're going to do to help affix the eyes into position is just put a drop of super glue right down on the hook shank where the eyes are going to go. Now before we place the eyes on, we're actually going to wrap the thread around the dumbbell eyes first. This will further help lock them into position, and then we're going to put a series of diagonal wraps all in the same direction. I like to do about 10 wraps. Afterwards, we're going to go ahead and do a series of wraps in the opposite direction. It's okay if the eyes look a little askew right now. As we put these wraps in the opposite direction, again do the same, maybe about 10. Put a little bit of tension with your fingers. This will help encourage the eyes to get back straight. After about the same number of wraps, you should notice the eyes are nice and straight, and we can lock them into place using a series of wraps underneath. Again, I like to do about 10. So now we're going to be tying in the first part of our tail. To do this, we're going to actually advance the thread down the bend of the hook slightly. Maybe no more than a quarter, something around here. This is going to allow us to have a little bit more of a curvature to our fly. So the first material we're going to put in is our Krinkle flash. Take about 2 strands of flash, and what we're going to do is we're going to end up doubling this up on itself, folding it in half, and then go ahead and cut that loop. This is going to give us the equivalent of about 4 strands. You may want to make sure that all your strands are the same length. If any of them are a little longer, give them a cut. Now we're going to attach to our hook by folding the strands over our thread and using the thread to guide these strands into place. This is going to give us a very secure connection and make it really easy for us to be able to position this flash exactly where we want to. Once we have it in place, we're going to go ahead and lay a series of wraps down that bend in order to place those in the position. You may need to cut them a little bit more to make sure they're semi-even, or you can go a scraggly look if you want and have them a bit more tapered by having different lengths. That's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and bring my thread back to this point, kind of right behind the eyes. You notice I have a little bit of a bump from the material, and that's perfect, because that's exactly where we're going to begin to tie in our Estaz material. Again, this is a polar chenille, but really any type of Estaz or kind of long, kind of sparse, scraggly fiber will be perfect. Our goal here is to tie it in not all the way back to where we have our flash, but just behind it. This is going to give us plenty of room to wrap around without crowding that flash. So here I've advanced my thread up to the eye of the hook and put in a half hitch. I have a rotary vise, so this allows me to get my thread out of the way to be able to palmer my chenille around our hook. If you don't have a rotary vise, that's fine. You still want to advance your thread up. So we're going to lay our wraps around our hook. By the way, you should do this in the same direction in which you wrap your thread. Notice here I'm going underneath the dumbbell eyes, not over top. This prevents the material from getting too much friction if it's bouncing along the bottom, and will make the fly more durable. So we're going to continue palmering or wrapping our material all the way up, being careful not to trap the fibers laid previously as we advance forward. Now we're not going to come all the way up to the eye of the hook. Instead, we're going to come up maybe about an eye length back. And there we're going to go ahead and secure in our material. To do this, we're simply going to wrap our thread back and wrap over the material. And we're going to do in a series of wraps behind and in front of the material. So what I mean by this is put your thread where it goes behind where the cord of your material is and wrap over and above it, and then put another wrap in front of that material. This is going to lay a series of crisscrosses and really secure this material in place. Once you've done at least two, you can cut off your excess and just trim things up a little bit. I also like to wind back a little bit more because it forces the fibers to go in a kind of back towards the tail reverse direction and keeps them a little bit more manageable, although they're still pretty scraggly, which is good for this fly. The next thing we're going to want to do is trim this a little bit better into shape. So because this is an inverted fly, I'm going to cut off a lot of the fibers from the bottom of the fly, which is actually the top when we have it laid in the vise. I'm also going to go ahead and trim any that are sticking way out to the side. So I only want them going up towards or down, depending on your orientation, basically going towards the hook point. So I'm going to trim a little bit here along the side of the fly and give it, more of that shrimp-like shape that I want. Again, think of shrimp. They've got a very smooth kind of underside and then lots of legs and scraggly bits, kind of where they curl around their tail. So we're going to try to imitate that as best we can. You don't have to go too crazy with your trimming, but, a little bit of grooming now really helps make this fly look that much better. So I'm going to go ahead and things are looking pretty good. You can see how, already it's taken a pretty good shape. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wrap back again. And again, I like to wrap a little bit over. It helps kind of force everything in the direction I want. And now I'm going to put on a little bit of orange bucktail. Now, it's important with your bucktail that you don't put too terribly much on. It should be, maybe a quarter of a pencil in diameter. When it flares, it shouldn't be much more than the hook gap width and very sparse. See here, I'm pulling out the shorts. So when you cut off the bucktail, you're going to have some that are a little long. In this case, when they're real long, you can actually pull those out and reposition them, and you'll have some that are really short. You kind of want to groom this and manage it and make things a little bit more tapered and even. Once you have it to length, we're going to go ahead and trim your excess and position it at an angle. Now, the overall length we're looking for is something that is about as long as our flash material. As we tie, we're going to be pulling up. If you pull down, the material will want to spin around the hook, but by pulling up, we can actually position it in place. The other thing that you want to do is put the first few wraps relatively loose. This allows you to reposition, as you've seen here, where you can actually pull the material back slightly and get a really nice, clean eye. If you don't get a clean eye now, that's fine. We can always fix that later with a lighter or something. The goal here is to have a taper in the front of this fly and have bucktail that sits back at a nice angle on top of our palmered body wrap material. To add a little bit more flair to this fly, I've added in this kind of small micro style flash. Again, this is a fluoro fiber in a shrimp coloration. Now my flash, especially these small thin pieces, I like to cut the edge of the packet off. That allows me to pull out only the fibers that I need. And I like to do that with my whip finishing tool and go ahead and cut it off. Now you can see here my thread is slightly behind the eye of the hook. That's because I'm trying not to crowd the eye. And we're doing the same thing we did before where we wrap it around the thread and allows us to pull it right into place. We're going to put in a few wraps to secure the material, make sure it's laying the way that we want, and then make sure that we don't come back any farther than the bucktail. If we go too far back, we're going to mess with the position of the bucktail. So we really want to have that as the absolute last point and tie all of our other materials in a little bit closer. Here I'm just using my bodkin to make sure that this is going to lay correctly. Best to do it now before I move on to the next material. Things are looking pretty good, but I still have some scraggly fibers. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a little bit more of a haircut and try to keep things into shape. For our next material, we're going to put in these rubber legs. Now I have some multicolored silly orange rubber legs, but you can really use any type that you want. Simply pull from the sheet. In my case, one length is long enough. So I'm going to fold over our thread just as we've done with our flash material and use my thread to place it directly in the position I want. Now, if you notice, I'm also putting a lot of tension on the rubber legs and really stretching them out. That's going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to allow the material to have a thinner profile when I place it in with the thread. And the other thing is, it's actually going to lock it into place a little bit better because the material is going to want to bunch back over and it's going to be laid in with tension. Now, I'm not going to tie it all the way back, just a few wraps to secure over the top. And then as you see here, I'm actually laying the legs and trying to pull them underneath the eye. We're going to do this to have a kind of horizontal position when these legs are finally tied in. To achieve this, we're going to put those legs under the eyes, under some tension, and that's going to bring both sides down pretty evenly along the sides of our fly. And you'll see now how they're actually tied in the position where we need them to be so that they'll ride more horizontal as it goes through the water. Now we're just going to try to tidy up a little bit. Again, here's where you can end up with a really large, kind of sightly head if you're not careful by laying in too many wraps. This is one of the reasons why I like to use a UTC 140. Try to keep it a little bit more even, and once you have things tidied up, go ahead and put in a whip finish and cut off your excess thread. You can see here that I still have some rubber legs that, well, they're a little bit longer than they need to be. So what we want to do is pull the legs and try to do this at the same time to make them nice and even. Pull them back, but don't pull them under tension or you'll end up cutting them too short. Let them hang a little bit loose and try to cut them about the same length as the tail or the overall flash and bucktail. That's going to give a kind of nice profile to this fly and make everything pretty consistent. At this point, the fly is totally capable to fish, but since it is going to be along the bottom, we're going to try to make it a bit more durable by putting in some head cement. You're going to want to put this over your thread wraps in the front, and you can even put this a little bit along the bottom of the fly. Just be careful when you're doing this, especially if you're using a rotary vise, not to put any head cement on some of your other materials. I always like to put some on the top of the dumbbell eye since that's the most likely to hit the bottom. But again, I'll put some a little bit along, let's call it the spine of this fly, just to add to that overall durability. And that's pretty much all there is to the Hawaiian shrimp fly. You can see here from this profile, it really does have a very natural imitation to a lot of the crustaceans that we may find in our freshwater and saltwater environments. I'm not sure why the orange color is so attractive, but it does seem to work. If you want, you can try this in other colors. I would highly suggest pink, or definitely chartreuse. Well, that's all there is to this fly. Thank you very much for following along, and I hope you learned something. This would be a great pattern, by the way, for the upcoming Legends of the Fly tournament, or really any time that you want to hit one of these environments and try something different.